75,000 soldiers gone. Not defeated, not retreating, but erased. The most powerful empire in the known world, an empire that had ruled the Middle East for over 300 years, lost everything it held between Egypt and Persia in less than a single week. Men did not just die on that plateau, they ran. They ran so fast that they left their weapons behind, shields and swords scattered across the ground like abandoned weight. And the emperor who had sent them into that battle never came back to reclaim what was left. And the worst part of this story is not the scale of the defeat. It is the fact that the general commanding that army saw it coming. He understood that the battle was slipping away from him. He still had tens of thousands of soldiers alive, still capable of fighting, still capable of retreating. And yet, he chose not to withdraw. He chose to stand. This is not just another battle in history. This is a moment where something breaks and never recovers. Because the army that did this was not supposed to win. They were outnumbered, lacking siege weapons, lacking a navy, lacking the kind of professional military structure that had sustained Rome for centuries. They had only recently become a unified fighting force, and yet they did not simply defeat Rome in the east. They erased its presence from the region entirely. Historians still describe Yarmouk as one of the most decisive battles ever fought, not simply because of the number of casualties, but because of the consequences that followed it. What makes this even more unsettling is that the Byzantine Empire had already defeated this enemy once before. They had driven them back, declared victory, and celebrated it. The emperor had been confident enough to send his army home. But something changed, and he was forced to call them back again. The second time, they never returned. There are three questions that define this battle. First, why did the Byzantine general, who knew by the fourth day that the battle was lost, refuse to retreat? Second, what happened on the sixth day that had nothing to do with swords or tactics, but turned a disciplined army into a panicked mass of men? And third, who was the commander sent at the last moment to take control of the opposing force? A man who had never lost a battle in his life. And what did he do in his first 24 hours that changed everything? To understand what was destroyed at Yarmouk, you have to understand what the Byzantine Empire was at that moment. This was not a weak or collapsing state. Just a few years earlier, it had survived a war that should have ended it. The Persian Empire had taken Jerusalem, seized one of Christianity's most sacred relics, and pushed deep into Byzantine territory. For a moment, it seemed like the empire was finished, but Emperor Heraclius refused to accept that outcome. He rebuilt his army, personally led a campaign deep into Persian lands, and by the year 628 AD, he had reversed everything. Jerusalem was recovered, Egypt was restored, and the empire stood whole again. He was not a failing emperor. He was one of the most capable rulers the empire had produced in generations. And yet, less than a decade later, he found himself in Antioch, watching helplessly as his army faced destruction at Yarmouk. The threat that had emerged was not another empire. It came from the Arabian desert, from tribes that had once been dismissed as scattered and insignificant. These tribes were now united, organized, and driven by a belief system that Byzantine commanders did not fully understand. They were not fighting for land, wealth, or political power in the traditional sense. They believed they were fighting because they had been commanded by God. That belief created a type of soldier that did not calculate risk in the same way. They did not look at numbers and decide whether survival was likely. They moved forward regardless. Armies that fight to survive can be broken. Armies that believe death is not the end are far more difficult to stop. By the year 636, the situation had become serious enough that Heraclius gathered one of the largest armies the Byzantine Empire had fielded in decades. Soldiers came from multiple regions, Armenians, Slavs, and local allies, forming a massive and diverse force. Estimates vary, but it was unquestionably far larger than the army it faced. Opposing them was a force of roughly 30 to 40,000 men under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid. Every logical calculation pointed toward a Byzantine victory. Khalid looked at the battlefield and saw something else entirely. He saw terrain that could be used against a larger army. He saw an opportunity not just to fight, but to trap. Within the first day of his command, he reorganized his forces into flexible units, positioned elite cavalry behind his flanks, and identified the weak points in the opposing line. He had not fought on that ground before, but he understood it almost immediately. When the battle began, the Byzantine army advanced across the plateau under the intense heat of a Syrian summer. The ground was dry, the air heavy, and the soldiers exhausted from movement and preparation. Ahead of them stood an army that did not move, did not break formation, and did not show visible fear. As the distance between the two sides closed, something unusual happened. The opposing army began to speak, not in shouts or war cries, but in quiet, unified prayer. It was not a display of aggression, but of calm. That sound moved through the Byzantine ranks in a way that was difficult to explain, because it suggested that the men they were about to fight were not afraid of what was coming. The first impact is not clean. It is not controlled. It is chaos. Shields slam into each other with a force that rattles bones. Spears strike, splinter, and vanish into bodies before they can be pulled back. The front lines compress instantly. Men pushed so tightly together they cannot swing their weapons properly, forced instead to stab, shove, and struggle just to stay standing. A Byzantine soldier loses his footing and disappears beneath the press of bodies before he can even cry out. Another tries to pull him up but is dragged down with him. Somewhere to the left, a man screams as a blade cuts across his arm, the sound swallowed by the roar of hundreds of voices shouting over each other. Dust rises immediately, thick and choking, mixing with sweat and blood until the air itself feels heavy to breathe. Orders are shouted, but already they are harder to hear, harder to follow. The line is no longer a line. It is a mass of men locked together, each one fighting the person directly in front of him, unable to see anything beyond a few feet. And across that chaos, something feels wrong. The enemy does not break. They do not hesitate. They do not pull back. They keep coming forward, step by step, steady, controlled, as if the violence around them does not exist. By nightfall, neither side has won, but something has shifted. This was not going to be a quick victory. By the second day, the battle has changed. It is no longer a clash. It is a grind. The kind of fighting that wears men down piece by piece. Arms grow heavy. Shields feel heavier with every strike absorbed. The heat does not ease, the sun burning down on armor, turning it into something that traps heat instead of protecting from it. A Byzantine soldier raises his shield slower than he did the day before, a fraction too slow. The blow that lands against it drives him backward, his footing uncertain. He recovers, but not completely. The next strike comes faster, then another. There is no pause, no space to breathe. Men begin to fight on instinct rather than discipline. They react instead of thinking. Small mistakes begin to appear. A missed block, a delayed step, a gap opening in the line for just a second too long. And every time that happens, the enemy is there immediately, pressing into it, widening it. Across the battlefield, something else becomes clear. The opposing line is not weakening. Fresh faces replace tired ones. The men attacking do not look exhausted. They do not slow. They do not give space. But the Byzantine soldiers do. By the end of the third day, some of them have been fighting almost continuously, their movements slower, their reactions duller. Their bodies are still standing, but they are no longer as sharp, and the enemy knows it. By the fourth day, the Byzantine commander Gregory could see the situation clearly. The center of his formation was weakening. His flanks were under increasing pressure, and his cavalry had been unable to gain the advantage it was expected to deliver. He still had the option to retreat. He still had enough soldiers to withdraw in an organized manner and preserve the core of his army. But retreat carried consequences beyond the battlefield. It would mean abandoning Syria, a region central to the empire's stability and identity. Losing it would not just be a military setback, it would be a political and strategic collapse. Gregory chose to stand and commit fully to the fight. On the fifth day, the Byzantine army launched a major push, attempting to break the opposing line. For a moment, it appeared to be working. Momentum shifted, and there was a brief sense that victory might still be possible. Then something changed. From the edges of the battlefield, movement appeared. Fast, sudden, and wrong. Cavalry, not charging straight ahead, but sweeping wide, cutting across the flanks with speed that infantry could not match. Hooves thunder against the dry ground, kicking up clouds of dust that rolled ahead of them like a warning too late to act on. The first impact came from the side. A line of soldiers turned too slowly to face it. The cavalry crashed into them before they could reform, breaking formation instantly. Men were thrown aside, some cut down where they stood, others knocked off balance and trampled underfoot before they could rise. Then the second wave hit from the opposite flank. Now the army was no longer facing forward. It was turning, twisting, trying to respond to threats from both sides at once. Orders were shouted, but they overlapped, contradicted, and arrived too late. The shape of the formation began to collapse as units lost alignment with each other. What had been a controlled advance became confusion. What had been pressure became panic. And in the center, the soldiers who had been pushing forward realized something they could no longer ignore. They were no longer attacking. They were surrounded. On the sixth day, the wind came. It did not arrive gently. It swept across the battlefield with force, lifting dust from the ground and throwing it into the air until the horizon disappeared. Visibility dropped within moments. A Byzantine soldier tried to wipe his eyes, but it did nothing. The dust was everywhere, in his mouth, his lungs, choking every breath. He could hear shouting, but could not tell where it came from. Then the attack came. Out of the storm, shapes emerged suddenly. Blades struck before they were seen. Horses burst through the dust at full speed, their riders visible only at the last moment. There was no time to react, no time to form a defense. The line broke all at once. Men began to run, some toward what they thought was safety, only to find the edge of the plateau, where the ground dropped into steep ravines. In the confusion, they did not stop in time. Some fell. Others were pushed. The screams were brief and then gone. Others threw down their weapons, not out of surrender, but because they could no longer fight in conditions where they could not see. Units dissolved into scattered groups, each one acting on instinct instead of command. The army was no longer an army. It was a mass of men trying to survive, and survival was no longer possible. By the time the storm began to settle, the outcome was already decided. What remained was not defeat. It was disappearance. The consequences came immediately. Without an army to defend its territories, the Byzantine Empire lost control of its eastern provinces with shocking speed. Cities that might have resisted under normal conditions fell because there was no force left to protect them. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt slipped out of Byzantine control within a few years. Emperor Heraclius withdrew from the region, leaving behind lands that had been part of the empire for centuries. He never returned. The Battle of Yarmouk did not simply end in victory for one side. It marked the collapse of an entire regional order. The balance of power shifted, and the effects of that shift would shape the history of the Middle East for generations. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the commander whose decisions shaped the outcome, did not die on the battlefield. Despite a life spent in war, he died later under ordinary circumstances. The man who never lost a battle did not fall in one. Some battles decide territory. Others decide the direction of history itself. Yarmouk was one of them.